The Russian Sleep Experiment. Original author, unknown. Russian researchers in the late 40s kept 5 people awake for 15 days, using an experimental gas based on a stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake, so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and a 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized window in the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep but no bedding, running water, and toilets, and enough dried food to last all 5 over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemy of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored and noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversation got darker and darker after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, starting to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began, alternatively, whispering to the microphones in the one-way portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over on their comrades, the other subjects in captivity. At first, the researchers thought this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly, yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but the researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it. Or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second captive started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took books apart and smeared page after page with their own feces and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming from 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at very heavy levels of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, researchers said they would do something they wouldn't do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives. They were afraid that they were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase come in a calm, responsive voice. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out amongst the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open up the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately, the voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of the loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 test subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in as life. Food rations past day 5 had not been touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much water was on the floor and how much was blood was never actually determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portion of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of the flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the other researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the positions and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 subjects have been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the rib have been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All of the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tracts of all 4 could be seen working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of a few days. Most of the soldiers on the site were Russian special operatives, but many still refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber, and alternatively begged and demanded the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured having his testicles ripped off, and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought it off like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and an arm of one of the doctors. When his heart was seen to beat for more than 2 full minutes after he bled out to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone within reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords constantly begging for the gas to be returned and to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedation they gave him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought in to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier held that wrist as well. It took a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under. The instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that had died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal oxygen level. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had 9 broken bones in the struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles exerted on them. The second survivor, that had been the first of the group to start screaming, his vocal cords were destroyed and he was unable to beg or object to surgery. He only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval of the anesthetic gas brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, that they try the surgery without anesthetic. And he didn't react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them up with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should not be medically possible that this patient was still alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this was something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and paper fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patient was laughing continuously. Once paralyzed, the subject would only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short amount of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak again, they were asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, and why they had ripped their own guts out, and why they wanted to be given the gas. The only response that was given was, "I must stay awake." All three subjects' restraints were reinforced and placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential, and wanted to see what happened if they were put back in and put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all three stopped struggling the moment they let it slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious at this point that they were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds in all his might, first his left, then his right, then his left again, for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off of the pillow, blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired to the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes he would flatline inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut for a moment and his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in, now. His brainwave showed the same flatlines as the one who just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned his gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed the gun at the remaining subject still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go nocturnal. A safe haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused and aimed at the subject's head and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. "So nearly free." Guys, if you enjoyed this narration, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you to Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, and Chaos X, who are already patrons. If you want to have your name read at the end of every video, consider becoming a patron at the $10 or above tier. And for $5 or above, you can have your name in the description. It helps to keep the channel alive, and I appreciate every single one of you guys. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching. Share the video, all that fun stuff. Also, make sure you're following me on Twitter at RealCreepSin. That's in the description as well.